Hello. Before I continue, I'd like to thank those who are patient with me as I learn this podcast process. It's a new gig for this old dog trying to learn new tricks, but hopefully I'm gradually getting better. Please be patient. This podcast will give invaluable information that I can honestly say you will not get anywhere else. The last episode about the FAA contained a lot of regulation talk. I can't help my listeners who are at various stages of their aviation careers understand facts about the FAA, the industry, and the NTSB without laying the groundwork in order to clear the media fog that's been laid down. We have to go back to basics. The regulations, or CFRs, no matter how dry the material is, it's kind of an occupational hazard. So please bear with me. As Sir Winston Churchill stated, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. It's a slight variation of philosopher George Santayana's original version, but better prepares us for episode 3. The NTSB writes aviation accident history. But what if the NTSB is getting safety findings and recommendations wrong? How would we know? How would they correct the record? Well, another Winston Churchill quote, "History is written by the victors," alludes to the point I'm trying to make, which perhaps can be more accurately interpreted as history is written by those who control the narrative. The NTSB definitely controls the narrative. I'm Stephen Carbone, and this is By Reason of Air Safety. Demonstrated in the FAA episode, the government can be proactive, providing there are ways to stay ahead of problems, such as advancements in technology. However, the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, also known as the Board, is a reactive agency. As it is, an accident happens, the NTSB responds. The NTSB's job is to help the FAA correct any regulatory shortcomings, which the NTSB is happy to do. But does the board understand its responsibility to the FAA and the industry? Does the NTSB understand what the FAA does or how various aviation industries function? From my perspective, the NTSB doesn't play well with others, especially with the FAA. Having worked for both agencies, it's obvious the FAA possesses knowledge and experience the NTSB should have. The FAA holds a broader and more direct affiliation with industry. Close, but not too close. Trust, yet verify. While the NTSB maintains a 100-foot pole approach. Keep your distance, just don't look like you're keeping your distance. The NTSB has fallen victim to micromanagement. They operate as a collective, even when they're wrong. Professionally, the board has wasted numerous opportunities to improve its mission, becoming better investigators by familiarizing themselves with FAA oversight and the industry's day-to-day activities. These lost opportunities make for broader gaps in the NTSB's understanding of industry. As a result, the NTSB assures us government cannot fix everything. As we discussed in the FAA episode, the NTSB's mandates are restricted to Title 49 transportation because the board investigates 5 different transportation modes accidents, each with its own regulatory agency, and none with the direct ties to the NTSB. First, there's Marine, which is regulated by the United States Maritime Administration, the USMA, and the United States Coast Guard. Then there's Railway, which is regulated by the Federal Railroad Administration, the FRA. Highway is regulated by the Federal Highway Administration, the FHA. Pipeline is regulated by the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, the PHMSA. and aviation, alas, is regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. This podcast will only address the NTSB's relationship with the FAA. The NTSB's mission statement, as found on the NTSB website, is making transportation safer. We, the NTSB, carry out our mission by 1. Maintaining our congressionally mandated independence. What this means is the NTSB isn't biased for or against the regulatory agencies or industry. This is the NTSB's most important mandate by separating regulatory from investigative. 2. Conducting objective, thorough investigations. This podcast will analyze this bullet. 3. Deciding fairly and objectively appeals of enforcement actions by the FAA and the U.S. Coast Guard and certificate denials by the FAA. Now, this bullet, in regards to aviation, is affected by the NTSB judicial law judges, not necessarily the investigatory divisions. 4. Advocating for implementation of safety recommendations is the NTSB does advocate for safety recommendations, even if they aren't properly researched or verified. And 5, assisting victims and survivors of transportation disasters and their families. In this, the NTSB shines. The board and the media place a lot of recognition on the NTSB's aviation division, especially the major accident investigators, the GO team, whose members are portrayed as flying in the imaginary NTSB helicopter in emotionally charged made-for-TV movies, or in emotionally charged documentaries, or emotionally charged accident shows. The GO team investigators investigate airline accidents or special cases, like the 2002 Senator Wellstone accident or the 1999 JFK Jr. accident. These are high-profile accidents, so they're given the high-profile GO team. They are also the investigators on loan to foreign countries to assist. However, they're also not the best qualified to do any of these investigations. Why? Well, one problem is the NTSB never learns from history, so they've never been effective as an aviation investigatory agency. Remember, the board reacts. The board, for instance, never learned from deregulation. They only reacted to deregulation. While the FAA tries to stay ahead of change, the NTSB never learns from the change. They just react. I know the NTSB could be great. They have the means to shine brightly. They have a lot of talent. They just don't know how to use it correctly. And the NTSB doesn't know how not to use what they do have. So why the negativity? It's because the NTSB has been presented with countless opportunities to right the ship. It's not just that over 55 years of inaction is being called into question, but the investigations have been in error. When I hired on at the board in 2001, I'd already had a 19-year career working in the airline industry. I performed aircraft maintenance on both analog and the latest digital airlines in the industry, out of numerous airports. If you remember from episode 2, I referenced Title 14, Subchapter G, namely about the airline programs. Before I hired on at the board in 2001, before I became an NTSB major accident investigator, the NTSB never had an FAA certificated airline technician as a major investigator looking into the 4 aircraft specialties: aircraft maintenance, structures, systems, or engines, also known as power plants. When I arrived at the board, I had the required certificates, the experience, aircraft type and industry knowledge, and the skills the NTSB lacked. So what? Big deal. Well, the FAA's Flight Standards Inspector workforce, hundreds of inspectors, is divided equally 50-50 into 2 types of airline inspection units. One is operations, which includes pilots and flight attendants. The second is airworthiness. The title airworthiness captures both maintenance and avionics. So almost 50% of the FAA inspectors are still FAA certificated aircraft mechanics and avionics technicians. Each airworthiness inspector has many years, even decades, of aircraft maintenance and/or avionics experience and knowledge. So what? Who cares if half the FAA workforce is aircraft maintenance? What does it matter? The NTSB's Aviation Division, as an aviation investigatory agency, is designed to advise the FAA inspector workforce for both operations and airworthiness, how to accurately fix problems. The FAA airworthiness inspectors are responsible for each airworthiness certificate holder, whether it's an airline, a repair station, a tech school, a designee, or an air operator and its safety programs. The FAA airworthiness inspectors are also responsible for each of these certificate holders' training, quality control, quality assurance, parts, troubleshooting, major repairs, major alterations, personnel safety, maintenance, manuals, following maintenance manuals, management requirements, certifications, airworthiness releases, safety cultures, airport ramp safety, and so on. So to be clear, since 1967, the NTSB has had nobody who can understand these airworthiness responsibilities. Nobody who has this knowledge. Nobody who can boast about airworthiness experience. Each past NTSB major accident investigation had nobody who understood the concerns of industry's airworthiness problems that I just went through. Ever. If 50% of the FAA's responsibility is airworthiness, if 50% of the industry's responsibilities are airworthiness, how can the NTSB help the industry or help the FAA if nobody at the NTSB knows the airworthiness environment or its responsibilities? Since 1967, accident airworthiness issues were never investigated by anyone experienced in the aircraft specialties of aircraft maintenance, structures, systems, and engines. That's 4 investigatory groups looking at the aircraft and engines in an accident that nobody at the board has been qualified to investigate. So who has been investigating the airworthiness specialties? Engineers, and that's a serious problem with safety. Since 1967, the NTSB has been confusing the responsibilities of engineers and aircraft technicians certificated under Title 14 CFR, Part 65, Subparts D and E. The NTSB doesn't understand the difference between an engineer's training, skills, knowledge, and experience, and an FAA certificated aircraft technician's training, skills, knowledge, and experience. One major difference is, in industry, technicians work the aircraft. Engineers support the technicians. If the NTSB took these investigatory problems seriously, I'd have better hopes that the board was making aviation safe. But they don't, and they won't. And that's the disappointing part. The NTSB falls short, not because they're unable to be better, but because they don't want to be better. If the NTSB wanted to fix this major safety issue, the NTSB would have fixed this problem years ago. Think about the consequences of having unqualified NTSB investigators in the 4 specialties for decades. How did that affect air safety? Let's look at the NTSB's mandate, the regulations that direct the NTSB's responsibilities and define what an aviation accident investigation is. The NTSB investigates according to CFR, that's Code of Federal Regulations, Title 49, Transportation, Section 831.4, Nature of the Investigation. It does a great job of defining the NTSB's role in transportation investigations, specifically subparagraph A. The NTSB conducts investigations, or has them conducted, to determine the facts, conditions, and circumstances relating to an accident. The NTSB uses these results to determine one or more probable causes of an accident and to issue safety recommendations to prevent or mitigate the effects of a similar accident. It's pretty straightforward. So let's break down that regulation and see what it actually says. The NTSB conducts investigations or has them conducted. Okay, let's stop there. What does has them conducted mean? In other words, the NTSB may ask the FAA to conduct an accident investigation if the NTSB is overwhelmed with other accidents. Let's continue. To determine the facts, conditions, and circumstances relating to an accident. Okay, we need to break this down. Title 49 CFR Section 835.2, a factual incident report, says, in the case of a major accident investigation, group chairman factual reports are factual accident reports. Facts means no speculation, no generalizations, and no opinions. Facts are provable. They're not emotional. They cannot be disproved. And here is another big problem. Many NTSB reports have over the years been submitted for substituting for facts with opinions based on emotions and speculation. Terms like it is believed or it might be are examples of non-facts found in accident reports. So the facts are being replaced by opinions based on emotions and speculation. The final reports are violating Section 835.2, and opinions like hearsay are not qualified sources. They can't be verified in fact. That makes the reports unqualified rhetoric. Then there's the word conditions, which means factual contributing elements, such as weather, human factor abuses, medical tests, and much more. Or circumstances means things like union activities, job actions, low visibility, mergers, de-icing requirements, and inadequate training, among other things. So if NTSB investigators with no airline experience don't understand the facts, conditions, and circumstances of airlines or airliners, if they never flew for an airline, maintained an airliner, or oversaw the safety of passengers, how can they understand what they're investigating? How will they know what to look for? The problem is they can't. Why? Because these NTSB aircraft specialty investigators have zero airline experience. Aircraft technicians take years of working aircraft to become familiar with the systems and engines. How can an engineer who never touches or sees an aircraft determine accident cause? Consider the consequences of unqualified accident investigators investigating the accident aircraft and the airline. Let's continue with Title 49 CFR 831.4a. Okay, the NTSB uses these results to determine one or more probable causes of an accident. We really need to take a serious look at this. What is probable cause? Actually, probable cause is undefined in the transportation regulations. Probable cause is undefined everywhere, except in criminal law, which doesn't apply in aviation accident investigations. What then does each word probable and cause mean? Well, probable, as defined, means likely to be the case or to happen. In other words, maybe, probably. While cause, as defined, means a person or thing that gives rise to an action, phenomenon, or condition. So probable cause means an ambiguous cause to an accident that isn't necessarily fact-based. Do we think the NTSB arriving at a maybe, quite possibly, not quite sure cause will satisfy the flying public's need to know why an aircraft crashed? And if the NTSB can't define probable cause, how can they determine they can't define in an aircraft what they can't define in an aircraft? The NTSB, by regulation, has been looking for something. They don't know what it is and can't define it. One more sentence fragment. And to issue safety recommendations to prevent or mitigate the effects of a similar accident. If prevent means to stop from happening again, and mitigate means to make less severe, serious, or painful, how can NTSB investigators who don't know what probable cause is, don't have experience or knowledge in airline matters, and don't know what they're looking for, how can they prevent or mitigate future accidents? How can these investigators know the findings or recommendations? Think about the consequences of not knowing what cause to look for in an aircraft accident investigations. Have opinions and speculation become real problems? ValueJet 592 accident report, which contained numerous opinions, some contradicting the report's other findings from maintenance, also pilot smoke goggles or cargo compartment safety. Speculations led to paths to nowhere. The board speculated about cargo compartment safety. This speculation forced millions of dollars in aircraft modifications that did not address any safety items. The Fine Air 101 accident report made allegations about questionable maintenance practices without examples or proof. Recommended using an unapproved weight and balance system based on hearsay. And the structures and operations investigators contradicted each other's findings. Speculation is costly and unproductive. We have established current NTSB accident investigators for the aircraft specialties, aircraft maintenance, structures, systems, and engines, are not qualified to be investigating major aircraft accidents. It's not because these investigators are engineers. That's not it. It's because engineers don't work in the airlines or many other aviation industries, and they aren't FAA certificated. Aircraft specialty NTSB investigators lead their teams as group chairmen. NTSB group chairmen must not rely on their party members for everything. It's too easy to be fooled by party members who understand the airline industry and the aircraft better than the group chairman does. The group chairman has to be competent against a team that would distort facts without hesitation. Anyone who has worked in the airline environment knows when an aircraft is broken on the line, the pilot doesn't call for an engineer. The pilot calls for an aircraft mechanic who is certificated, trained, experienced to fix the aircraft, and qualified to release the aircraft for return to service. When I investigated major accidents for the NTSB, my party members from the FAA and the airline were all maintenance representatives. Airframe and engine manufacturer party members belong to accident teams, special teams for the manufacturer, specifically chosen by their company to know more than engineers, than NTSB engineers. The same exact specialist teams work with the other three specialties as well, systems, structures, and engines. So 4 groups have these maintenance specialists up against engineers who they have the better information for against. What this does is it protects the airline and manufacturer from the NTSB. These people know the aircraft after it entered the airline service, not at the irrelevant point of manufacture many years before. There is a big difference between newly manufactured and one in airline service. But engineers are specific. An engineer might have worked nothing but anti-ice systems or navigation systems. At a manufacturer where engineers work, they don't cross engineers between aircraft systems. So an aircraft anti-icing engineer won't know anything about a hydraulic system or a flight control system. Engineers don't work the flight line. Engineers don't work the hangar. Engineers don't troubleshoot. Engineers don't make structural repairs. Engineers don't replace components. Engineers don't test systems after replacing components. Engineers don't defer items. Engineers don't change engines. Engineers don't ops check the engines they just changed. And engineers aren't qualified, trained, experienced, or certificated to sign the airworthiness release per Title 14 CFRs. Furthermore, NTSB accident investigators for the aircraft specialties receive no aircraft training on the aircraft they're investigating, period. So how do they know what they're looking at? According to Title 49 CFR Section 831.8, the qualifications of an investigator in charge, also known as the IIC, are spelled out. The IIC has the responsibility of all that goes on with the accident investigation. This person is the investigatory coordinator for the entire accident investigation. But how do IICs get their jobs? They are brought in from the NTSB investigator workforce, the same investigators who are unqualified, untrained, uncertificated, inexperienced, and without factual knowledge. Think about the consequences of having NTSB accident investigators who haven't been qualified to investigate for years. We established NTSB aviation investigators lack active airline or operator experience. Well, what else? What Section 831.8 doesn't require is the IIC be trained in the aircraft being investigated. Wouldn't it help the IIC to know the aircraft and operator being investigated? Can IICs and aircraft specialty investigators receive training on the accident aircraft? Behind me, in the bookcase, are training manuals. In 2001, I investigated Emory Air Freight Flight 17, a DC-8 freighter that crashed on takeoff out of San Mateo, California. These are the DC-8 these are my Emory DC-8 training manuals. Emory didn't give them to me. I told them I wanted them. I was the first aircraft specialty investigator to ever do that, to get the training manuals. As the aircraft maintenance investigator, I needed to learn the DC-8 from the training offered by Emory per Title 14 CFR Part 121.375. These are the books that they gave me. I wanted to understand the DC-8, but more importantly, I wanted to know how Emory's technicians and their repair stations were being trained on the Emory DC-8. It's just common sense. It's also common sense that every NTSB accident investigator for the aircraft should receive and review the training materials for the accident aircraft. Every aircraft specialty investigator should have manuals like these. It's common sense. But Emory 17 was a pivotal accident investigation. Why? It was the first time a cargo airliner investigation, or any airline investigation, identified an airline's culture as the root cause of the accident. An airline's culture is something an engineer wouldn't recognize, wouldn't understand. Emory 17 should have been the board's wake-up call to the pointlessness of probable cause and launch the board in a direction to seek root cause, which is what the FAA uses to identify problems. But also, Emory 17 recognized contracting problems that would lead to accidents like Air Midwest 5481, Colgan 9446, and National Air Cargo 102, or even called attention to accidents the board missed, like Fine Air 101. It wouldn't be the first or the last time the board ignored cargo airliner accidents because they just didn't attract enough attention. Now, regarding training, how can the investigators understand the accident aircraft without understanding the accident aircraft systems and engines? NTSB investigators don't just know these things. Without understanding the aircraft, how can any NTSB investigator determine the findings or the recommendations? Think about the consequences of having decades of unqualified NTSB accident investigators not receiving proper training for decades. What about NTSB quality control? The NTSB has been around since 1967, yet they've never modified their procedures, investigatory techniques, CFR misinterpretations, poor training, hiring practices, and so on. They don't employ internal analysis or corrective actions. Remember, the FAA's FSEP program we spoke about last episode. The NTSB never self-evaluated or self-audited ever. They criticize airlines for not employing quality programs, but don't have their own quality control program in place. In other words, do as I recommend, not as I do. So think about the consequences of having the NTSB never conducting self-audits to revise their investigatory practices and procedures for decades. NTSB management. So where do NTSB supervisors, managers, and upper management come from? Like IACs, they come from the investigator ranks. So again, consider if NTSB investigators are unqualified, inexperienced, and lack any knowledge of the aircraft and operators they investigate, then it's understandable that NTSB management and upper management on all levels are the same unqualified, inexperienced people lacking any knowledge of the aircraft and operators. Management are former unqualified and inexperienced NTSB engineer investigators. Think about the consequences of having an NTSB with unqualified investigators being managed by unqualified managers for decades. The Sunshine Meeting is uncomplicated. We're going to talk about this first. It takes place after the final report has been finished. Now, board members are responsible to read the report personally, not delegate this responsibility to staff. Board members will then adopt, not approve, the report or send it back for further review. However, in the past, board members have unwisely used the Sunshine Meeting for sarcasm or naive opinions about the operator, about the manufacturer. These types of comments are unnecessary and unprofessional. Board members are basically final editors for the general public's understanding. With accident hearings should take place as soon as possible after the event. In a hearing, board members are mediators to keep the hearing on track. If something is too technical, well, they can ask questions for clarification. Board members are not, by regulation or otherwise, there to run the investigation, contribute to the investigation, or especially grandstand. Now, we can lay out the regulations pertaining to board members, but I don't want to get too deep into the regulations for reasons of time. They can be found at Title 49 CFR, Subtitle B, Chapter 8, Part 800, Section 800.2, and United States Code 2023, Title 49, Subchapter 2, Section 1111. And these lay out the basics. Board members aren't trained to investigate. They're not schooled in the proper handling of evidence, including redacting proprietary or personal information, such as Social Security numbers on certain documents. Board members should not interfere in the investigatory process. Case in point. Courtesy of a major aviation accident hearings transcript. In this major aviation accident, a cable-driven flight control system was found to be misrigged. A board member tried to ask a question they thought was relevant, but really wasn't. Now I'm going to quote the board member directly to make my point. Sir, I live on a houseboat, and you have lines on a houseboat. They tend to shift over time. Tension, weather, things like that. Do you see in your mind any similarity between a cable and a line in that they do adjust over time, that there are issues involving, or are they just perfectly stationary without any change because of temperature or wear or stress? That was verbatim out of the official transcript. Now, after the entire hearing room went silent from confusion, the witness tried to make sense of the question and answer. However, the board member continued. Is 2 inches a lot, sir? When you're talking about systems, such as cables in an airplane, would you consider 2 inches a significant amount? This is an example of how a board member's irrelevant nonsense interfered with an active investigation in an official hearing. This wasn't a question. It was about getting the board member some attention. Now, 2 things we learned from this exchange. 1, the board member owned a houseboat. It wasn't clear if the board member needed advice on maintaining the houseboat, but the listening audience, including grieving family members, found out that the board member owned a houseboat. And 2, the board member asked the houseboat question obviously had no idea what was being discussed. And yet the board member felt compelled to inject a useless question into a serious discussion that the board member didn't understand. And as a result, wasted 1/2 hour of time pursuing this line of questioning. Now, there's an old saying, it's better to keep your mouth closed and thought a fool than to open it and remove all doubt. But this example is indicative of deeper problems. Why are board members allowed to comment or ask irrelevant questions that mock the accident investigation's integrity? And 2, how are victims' families supposed to draw solace from obvious displays of incompetence and grandstanding? How does the transportation industry draw assurance that NTSB recommendations are being treated seriously or soberly? The industry's silence in the face of this and other such displays of silliness are deafening. Why is industry ignoring the emperor's lack of clothing? This is a dangerous trend, a slippery slope, and it's been going on for many years. It's getting out of hand. For some reason, board members think the title board member qualifies them to take part in active investigations. This houseboat exchange demonstrates that these interruptions are distracting away from the real accident investigation. Valuable time is being deprived from the accident party members to drill down to much needed facts, only to give a board member a chance to play investigator. So let's be clear. The 5 board members, no matter what their background, are management, nothing else. In industry, managers support their employees, not the other way around. Investigators don't cater to the board members' whims. As managers, board members should ensure the investigators have all the resources needed. And that's what management does. That's all that management does. But board members are not investigators, have not been trained as investigators, and are not, by regulation, to get involved in active accident investigations. This is a dangerous practice that board members believe they have the right to insert themselves in active investigations. Another example of board member interference was the recent Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 door departure hearing. The board members intentionally blocked Boeing from participating as a party member during the hearing, in direct violation of established NTSB procedures. For one, the board members' actions affected the quality of evidence learned. Hearings are for facts, not to assign blame. For 2, the board members picked and chose what evidence they, the board members, wanted to hear, not what evidence was necessary to be presented. And 3, the board members had no reason to exclude Boeing. For board members to behave this unprofessionally begs the question: if board members are going to pick and choose the evidence, why have a hearing? In episode 2, I spoke about the FAA becoming a shadow of its former self. In these two examples, the NTSB has become a caricature of what it was meant to be, a serious, professional, investigative agency. The houseboat and blocking Boeing's participation are just two of many examples where NTSB board members interfered and how that interference is detrimental to increasing safety from an aircraft accident investigation. Other board members' examples of interfering were demonstrating complete ignorance of a CFR's intent, sarcastic statements made about operators, treating the hearing like a law process, subjective accusations without facts, misleading comments about required equipment, and a lack of research into how regulations are revised. Now consider the antiquated thinking by board members in choosing accident investigations. Board members are political appointees, bureaucrats who force themselves into situations beyond their understanding. Board members pretend to investigate. They insert themselves midway through the active investigation, taking the credit without actually doing the work. Board members are the worst type of managers, micromanagers, acting outside their regulation-stated job descriptions. And those board members with aviation experience are even worse, encouraging other board members to interfere. They should know better. An accident investigation isn't a bucket list. It's not a photo op. It's certainly not a board member's right to participate. Accident investigation is a serious commitment to aviation safety. No accolades, no applause, no name in the paper. In the houseboat and Boeing events, board members showed everyone they aren't serious people. Industry knows the board members are unqualified. Industry knows the board members are undisciplined, interfering in the process. These wastes of time and effort hurt the fact-finding process. It would be great if Sean Duffy could interfere for safety. Think about the consequences of having the NTSB board members interfering in every major accident investigation just to have their time in front of the cameras for decades. It is long overdue for the NTSB to be rebuilt from the ground up, create quality controls, establish who are qualified investigators, who are support staff, and who are the managers, and never the twain shall meet. If not, turn the NTSB duties over to a private agency outside of this government nonsense. But that is my opinion. Safety is also my opinion, has suffered long enough. Until next time, I'm Stephen Carbone reminding you to tab. Think safe, act safe, be safe. Take care.